Welcome in, everybody. This is your self-care staffing for Monday, April 27th, 2020. I am Lou Pascal. I'm the school social worker in the Manchester City Schools in Manchester, Tennessee. I'm very excited because I'm going to be doing a series this week on a particular self-care practice. We're going to talk about reading as self-care. Those of you who know me, those of you who've been watching these videos for a while, have heard me refer to reading quite a lot. You have most likely gathered that reading is a go-to method of self-care for me. I obviously have a fondness for reading, and a lot of that comes from the fact that some of my very best memories involve reading. So I'm very fortunate in that as a school social worker, I've had the opportunity to return to work in the school system that I attended as a child. So when I was in elementary school, there were a couple of initiatives that our school implemented to encourage reading. One of them was called Great Books. The other one was called President's Club. And I was able to participate in both of those. And those were really enjoyable for me, really formative experiences where I was encouraged to make reading a part of my life. When I was in college at MTSU, I took a Southern literature class and I was introduced to Southern literature as a genre, and I'm still reading Southern literature to this day. I have worked in libraries when I attended graduate school at the University of Tennessee. My program was at the Nashville campus, and I worked in the social work library during that time. As I was just starting my school social work career and we were not working in the summer times, I actually worked in my local public library during those times for several years. And some of my fondest memories are of talking books with my family. My family spends a lot of time talking about books. And in particular, I remember that being part of the relationship between myself and my grandmother. And my grandmother used to call smartphones your little darling. So she would say to me from time to time, get on your little darling and send some books to my Kindle. You know what I like. And so it meant a lot to me that we had had enough conversations that I did know what she liked. And she lived in a really small town and she couldn't always go and be away from home as a matter of course. And she supported her local library. She was an ardent supporter. She was a library board member, but it was a smaller place and they didn't have as many resources in terms of materials as you can find in some bigger cities or towns. And so it meant a lot to me that I knew what she liked just because we talked about it so much, and that in those times when she couldn't be away from home as much, that I could get her access to those materials that made her time at home more pleasant if she really wanted to be out and doing things and she couldn't be. So one other part of reading that I want to talk about some throughout this video is the idea of a commonplace book. And people have kept commonplace books for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years. Thomas Jefferson had a commonplace book. There are a lot of influential people who have commonplace books. And that's just a collection of quotes that you've read over the years and you just make it a point to write them down. Or it could be quotations of conversations that you've had with people, or it could be just different experiences that you've had. And they all go in this dedicated place, this commonplace book. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more later, but I wanted to ask you a self-care check-in question today, and that is, what does reading mean to you? So does reading have a positive place in your life, or do you kind of look at reading in more of a negative light and it hasn't maybe been a good experience for you? I just want you to give some thought to that today. Think about what reading means to you. So now I'm going to give you some quotes, and as I mentioned in other videos, every single quote that I'm giving you during the course of this series, all of the self-care staffings that I've done, come from my personal commonplace book. So as I'm putting together the format for the video, I always check there and see if I have any quotes that are applicable, and so far I always have. So that's where all of those originate. So here's some quotes. The first one is kind of just a general encouragement for reading, and it says, "And once you can read anything, you can learn everything." And that was Delia Owens from Where the Crawdads Sing. The next several are going to come from one particular book, and it's a book from someone who had been established for several years in public service, and he's sort of writing letters to mentor younger professionals coming up in that sort of world of public service. So he says, "You don't want to spend a large part of your life reading? I can tell you one thing with certainty. If you don't want to read, you will soon be working for someone who does." So it is not a bad thing to work for someone for the entirety of your career. I think his main message is you're going to want to have some things to discuss with that person, and a wonderful place to find those things is in your reading. Another quote from that same book, "And don't tell me after you get on your job you don't have time to read. You must make time from whatever else you do." And then he has a quote inside this quote, "Do you long for the conversation of the wise? Learn to understand it and you shall hear it." So he's saying that you learn to understand the conversation of the wise from reading. Here's another one. "You need to be reading. You need to be recharging your batteries. Henry Kissinger said somewhere that the difficulty with top-level jobs is that you cannibalize the knowledge and information you have in your head when you take the job. You use up your intellectual capital because you never have time to replace it." So I think with that, he's really saying your reading will be a lot of the source of your creativity. It will give you ideas for what the next step is in the big picture vision of your work. So all of those came from Kenneth Ashworth, and the book is called Caught Between the Dog and the Fire Plug, or How to Survive Public Service. And I'm going to have another quote from him in just a minute, but those all came from that book. Here's a quote from Ray Bradbury, who wrote Fahrenheit 451. He says, "I absolutely demand of you and everyone I know that they be widely read in every field there is, in every religion and every art form. And don't tell me you haven't got time. There's plenty of time. You need all of those cross-references." And we're going to talk about cross-references in just a second when we talk a little bit more about commonplace books. But that was Ray Bradbury, and that was quoted by Annie Spence, and the book was called Dear Fahrenheit 451, Love and Heartbreak in the Stacks, a librarian's love letters and breakup notes to the books in her life. So let's talk a little bit more about commonplace books. One of the reasons that I like to keep a commonplace book is because every once in a while I read something and it's just like amazing to me that a writer could put those words together in that way, and I just want to remember it. So here's an example of that. The quote is, "She looked like a sunset in human form." I just thought that was fantastic. And so that was Jamie Attenberg, and the book was called All This Could Be Yours. Here's some other quotes about commonplace books. And this is Kenneth Ashworth again. "Incidentally, you should start collecting quotations and vignettes from your reading and experience that you think you might find useful in your future speech making and writing." So as I said, every quote that I've given in all of these videos have come from my commonplace book. Here's just an example of how I use my commonplace book. When mine and my husband's grandparents died, we wrote some memorial remembrances of them. And I was able to find quotes in my commonplace book to use in all of those writings. So there's an example for you. One last quote about commonplace books. "For years now, I had been keeping small special notebooks into which I write passages that strike me hard as I read the work of others. Perhaps these are another form of diary. Certainly, they are deeply personal. I hadn't known when I started this practice that these are sometimes called commonplace books. The criterion is that the words must pierce me, stop me, so that I can go no further until I write them down, until I make them mine. You could say these are a record of my life. And that was Dani Shapiro, and the book was called Hourglass. So this week, while we're talking about reading, I don't have songs for every day, but I decided to substitute some children's books about reading as something I wanted to share with you today. So this is a really beautiful book. It's called Book, about reading for children, and I have several of these. I have a collection, I have a collection of books about reading for children. So this is by David Miles, and it's just called Book. So that I am happy to share that with you today. I am going to share a YouTube video with you today. It is a guy named Ryan Holiday talking about commonplace books, and two things about him. One, he has an email newsletter that's all about books that are good that you can subscribe and get. We'll talk about that in a later video. And he writes books, and a big part of his writing process is his commonplace book. Okay? Now, he's a big, I only read physical books guy, and you're going to see in the video his library. I don't have those specifications in my life, and we're going to talk also about different formats of books in other videos, but that's just a little bit of context for you for the video with Ryan Holiday talking about his commonplace book. So that is almost all that I have for today. If you feel like you're not a reader, please, please, please tune in for tomorrow's video, because we're going to talk about reading problems, and I'm hoping you'll find some encouragement to give reading another try and make it a part of your life and a part of your self-care. So, if all hearts and minds are clear, I appreciate you guys taking the time to be with me today, and I will see you with another video talking about reading tomorrow.